A Good Night, from Stories of Birds by Lenore Elizabeth Mulets. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Good Night. Phyllis listened again. "Oh, I see you now," laughed Phyllis. The owl moved silently as a shadow and perched very near to the little girl. His great round eyes and his yellow bill gleamed in the starlight. "I heard you calling," said Phyllis, "but I could not at first tell just where you were. I looked in a dozen trees before I came to you." "Too, too," questioned the owl. Phyllis laughed again. The owl blinked wisely. "I'm going home tomorrow," Phyllis said. "I shall start to school next week. Some day, perhaps, I shall be as wise as you, Mr. Owl." The owl only blinked his great eyes. "But I'm sure I could never look so wise," she added politely. "Hoo, hoo, hoo," hooted the owl, blinking sleepily. "If you will not talk with me, I shall say good night to you at once," said Phyllis. "To-hoo, to-hoo." "To you, to you," called Phyllis, running off laughing. "Papa," she said a few moments later, "Papa, the hoot owl would not talk with me." "Wise, wise owl," said Papa, smiling at her over his newspaper. End of A Good Night, from Stories of Birds by Lenore Elizabeth Mulets. Read by Nora Nelson.
Baker's Bluejay Yarn by Mark Twain. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Baker's Bluejay Yarn. Animals talk to each other, of course. There can be no question about that. But I suppose there are very few people who can understand them. I never knew but one man who could. I knew he could, however, because he told me so himself. He was a middle-aged, simple-hearted miner who had lived in a lonely corner of California among the woods and mountains a good many years, and had studied the ways of his only neighbors, the beasts and the birds, until he believed he could accurately translate any remark which they made. This was Jim Baker. According to Jim Baker, some animals have only a limited education, and some use only simple words and scarcely ever a comparison or a flowery figure, whereas certain other animals have a large vocabulary, a fine command of language, and a ready and fluent delivery. Consequently, these latter talk a great deal. They like it. They are so conscious of their talent, and they enjoy showing off. Baker said that after long and careful observation, he had come to the conclusion that the bluejays were the best talkers he had found among birds and beasts. Said he, "There's more to a bluejay than any other creature. He has got more moods and more different kinds of feelings than other creatures. And mind you, whatever a bluejay feels, he can put into language. And no mere commonplace language either, but bridling out-and-out book talk, and bristling with metaphor, too. Just bristling. And as for command of language, why, you never seen a bluejay get stuck for a word. No man ever did. They just boil out of 'em. And another thing, I've noticed a good deal, and there's no bird or cow or anything that uses as good grammar as a bluejay. You may say a cat uses good grammar. Well, a cat does, but you let a cat get excited once, you've let a cat get to pulling fur with another cat on a shed nights, and you'll hear grammar that will give you the lockjaw. The ignorant people think it's the noise which fighting cats make that is so aggravating. But it ain't so. It's the snickering grammar they use. Now, I've never heard a jay use bad grammar but very seldom, and when they do, they are as ashamed as a human. They shut right down and leave. You may call a jay a bird. Well, so he is, in a measure, but he's got feathers on him, and don't belong to no church, perhaps, but otherwise he is just as much human as you be. And I'll tell you for why. A jay's gifts and instincts and feelings and interests cover the whole ground. A jay hasn't got any more principle than a congressman. A jay will lie, a jay will steal, a jay will deceive, a jay will betray. And 4 times out of 5 a jay will go back on a solemnist promise. The sacredness of an obligation is such a thing which you can't cram into no bluejay's head. Now, on top of all this, there's another thing. A jay can outswear any gentleman in the mines. You think a cat can swear? Well, a cat can, but you give a bluejay a subject that calls for his reserve powers, and where is your cat? Don't talk to me. I know too much about this thing, and the one little particular of scolding, just good clean out-and-out scolding, a bluejay can lay over anything, human or divine. Yes, sir, a jay is everything that a man is. A jay can cry, a jay can laugh, a jay can feel shame, a jay can reason and plan and discuss. A jay likes gossip and scandal. A jay has got a sense of humor. A jay knows when he is an ass just as well as you do, maybe better. If a jay ain't human, he better take in his sign, that's all. Now I'm going to tell you a perfectly true fact about some bluejays. When I first begun to understand jay language correctly, there was a little incident happened here. 7 years ago, the last man in this region but me moved away. There stands his house. Been empty ever since. A log house with a plank roof. Just one big room and no more. No ceiling. Nothing between the rafters and the floor. Well, one Sunday morning I was sitting out here in front of my cabin with my cat taking the sun and looking at the blue hills and listening to the leaves rustling so lonely in the trees and thinking of the home away yonder in the States that I hadn't heard from in 13 years. When a bluejay lit on that house with an acorn in his mouth and says, "Hello, I reckon I've struck something." When he spoke, the acorn dropped out of his mouth and rolled down the roof, of course, but he didn't care. His mind was all on the thing he had struck. It was a knot-hole in the roof. He cocked his head to one side, shut one eye, and put the other one to the hole, like a possum looking down a jug. Then he glanced up with his bright eyes, gave a wink or two with his wings, which signifies gratification, you understand, and says, "It looks like a hole. It's located like a hole. Blamed if I don't believe it is a hole." Then he cocked his head down and took another look. He glances up perfectly joyful this time, winks his wings and his tail both, and says, "Oh, no, this ain't no fat thing, I reckon. If I ain't in luck. Why, it's a perfectly elegant hole." So he flew down and got that acorn and fetched it up and dropped it in, and was just tilting his head back with the heavenliest smile on his face, when all of a sudden he was paralyzed into a listening attitude, and that smile faded gradually out of his countenance like breath off a razor, and the queerest look of surprise took its place. Then he says, "Why, I didn't hear it fall." He cocked his eye at the hole again, and took a long look, raised up and shook his head, stepped around to the other side of the hole and took another look from that side, shook his head again. He studied a while, Then he just went into the details, walked round and round the hole and spied into it from every point of the compass. No use. Now he took a thinking attitude on the comb of the roof and scratched the back of his head with his right foot a minute, and finally says, "Well, it's too many for me, that's certain. Must be a mighty long hole. However, I ain't got no time to fool around here. I gotta tend to business. I reckon it's all right. Chance it anyway." So he flew off and fetched another acorn and dropped it in, and tried to flirt his eye to the hole quick enough to see what become of it. But he was too late. He held his eye there as much as a minute. Then he raised up and sighed and says, "Confound it, I don't seem to understand this thing, no way. However, I'll tackle her again." He fetched another acorn and done his level best to see what become of it. But he couldn't. He says, "Well, I never struck no such hole as this before. I'm of the opinion it's a totally new kind of a hole." Then he begun to get mad. He held in for a spell, walking up and down the comb of the roof and shaking his head and muttering to himself. But his feelings got the upper hand of him presently, and he broke loose and cussed himself black in the face. I never see a bird take on so about a little thing. When he got through, he walks to the hole and looks in again for half a minute. Then he says, "Well, you're a long hole and a deep hole, and a mighty singular hole altogether. But I've started to fill you, and I'm damned if I don't fill you if it takes 100 years." And with that, away he went. You never see a bird work so since you was born. He laid into his work like a nigger, and the way he hove acorns into that hole for about 2 hours and a half was one of the most exciting and astonishing spectacles I ever struck. He never stopped to take a look any more. He just hove 'em in and went for more. Well, at last he could hardly flop his wings. He was so tuckered out. He comes a-dropping down once more, sweating like an ice pitcher, dropped his acorn in and says, "Now, I guess I've got the bulge on you by this time." So he bent down for a look. If you'll believe me, when his head come up again, he was just pale with rage. He says, "I've shoveled acorns enough in there to keep the family 30 years, and if I can see a sign of one of 'em, I wish I may land in a museum with a belly full of sawdust in 2 minutes." He just had strength enough to crawl up to the comb and lean his back agin the chimney, and then he collected his impressions and begun to free his mind. I see in a second that what I had mistook for profanity in the mines was only just the rudiments, as you may say. Another jay was going by, and he heard him doing his devotions, and stops to inquire what was up. The sufferer told him the whole circumstance, and says, "Now yonder's the hole, and if you don't believe me, go and look for yourself." So this fellow went and looked, and comes back and says, "How many did you say you put in there?" "Not any less than 2 tons, says the sufferer. The other jay went and looked again. He couldn't seem to make it out, so he raised a yell, and 3 more jays come. They all examined the hole. They all made the sufferer tell it over again. They all discussed it, and got off as many leather-headed opinions about it as an average crowd of humans could have done. They called in more jays, then more and more, till pretty soon this whole region 'peared to have a blue flush about it. There must have been 5,000 of 'em. And such another jawing and disputing and ripping and cussing you never heard. Every jay in the whole lot put his eye to the hole and delivered a more chuckle-headed opinion about the mystery than the jay that went there before him. They examined the house all over, too. The door was standing half open, and at last one jay happened to go and light on it and look in. Of course, that knocked the mystery galley west in a second. There lay the acorns scattered all over the floor. He flopped his wings and raised a whoop. "Come here," he says. "Come here, everybody. Hanged if this fool hasn't been trying to fill up a house with acorns." They all came a swooping down like a blue cloud, and as each fella lit on the door and took a glance, the whole absurdity of the contract that first Jay had tackled hit home, and he fell over backwards, suffocating with laughter, and the next Jay took his place and done the same. Well, sir, they roosted around here on the housetop and the trees for an hour, and guffawed over that thing like human beings. It ain't any use to tell me a bluejay hasn't got a sense of humor, because I know better. And memory, too. They brought jays here from all over the United States to look down that hole, every summer for 3 years. Other birds, too, and they could all see the point, except an owl that come from Nova Scotia to visit the Yosemite, and he took this thing in on his way back. He said he couldn't see anything funny in it. But then he was a good deal disappointed about Yosemite, too. End of Baker's Bluejay Yarn by Mark Twain. Recording by Scotty Smith.
The Bittern by Walter Richard Cassels. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. Recording by Larry Wilson. The reeds are idly waving o'er the marshy ground, the rank and ragged herbage rots on many a mound, and desolate pools and marshes deadly lie around. There is no life nor motion, save the winds that fly with the close muffled clouds in silence through the sky. There is no sound to stir it, save the bittern's cry. The bittern, sitting sadly on the fluted edges of pillars, once the prop and pride of palace ledges, now smeared with damp decay and sunk in slimy sedges, shattered and sunken with a sculptured architrave, peering above the surface of the sluggish wave, like a gaunt limb thrust fleshless from a shallow grave. The bittern sitteth sadly on the time-worn stone, upon life's mouldering relics, fearfully alone, searing the silence ofttimes with his solemn tone. The bittern, monarch of the sad and dreary place, mocking the pride and pageant of a ruined race, whose very name's forgotten, and whose deeds have left no trace. The pleasant songs of peace, the lute, the lover's sigh, the statesman's eloquence, the warrior's battle cry, have passed, and like their echo from the heedless sky, the lonely bittern's note comes sadly floating by. O melancholy sound! Shall thus forever end the glory and the greatness whither all hopes tend? And as the past comes booming, shall the present wend? Nor ear to listen to the old and hard-earned glory, that wore the heart out, made the locks grow scant and hoary. No ear to listen, and no tongue to tell the story. The bittern sitteth midst the marshes of the past, sitteth amidst the ruins, whilst the hours fleet fast, and at his own hoarse cry he looketh round aghast. The hours fleet fast unnoted, and the time is nigh, when even he on noiseless wings shall soar on high, till his deep note is lost amid the azure sky. End of the Bittern by Walter Richard Cassels. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Black-capped Chickadee, Titmouse by Florence A. Merriam. From Birds Through an Opera Glass. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Black-capped Chickadee, Titmouse. Read Emerson's Titmouse, and you will recognize this charming little bird without the aid of your glass. Not only in spring and fall, but in the coldest winter days you will hear what Thoreau calls the silver tinkling, chickadee-dee-dee-dee, chickadee-dee-dee-dee, ringing through the air. When you hear it, if you look carefully over the trees, you will see a fluffy little body dressed out in a black hood, whose somber tone is relieved by whitish side pieces, a vest to match the sides of the hood, and a dark gray coat for contrast. Clinging to the side of a tree one minute, and hanging upside down pecking at the moss on a branch the next, it is flitting about hither and thither so busily that unless you draw near, you will hardly catch a glimpse of its black cap and gray and white clothes. You need not fear scaring it, for it has the most winning confidence in man, inspecting the trees in the front yard or those in the woods with the same trustful unconcern. You are inclined to think that the busy chickadee takes no time to meditate and sees only the bright side of life, and when you hear its plaintive minor whistle piercing the woods, you wonder if it can have come from the same little creature whose merry chickadee-dee you know so well. Thoreau calls this plaintive whistle the spring Phoebe's note of the chickadee, and gives its winter call as day, day, day. When happy, the chickadee is the best company one could hope for on a winter's walk. When busy, it seems to realize perpetual motion, and when it gives up its ordinary pursuits and prepares to rear a family, it goes to work in the same whole-souled fashion. Leaving civilization with its many distractions, it goes into the woods, and that is the last you see or hear of it until fall. Even there it is not content to sit perched up on top of an open nest, but builds in the side of a stump or a dead stub, and retires from the world with the determination of a nun. You will wonder at first how such a tiny bill as the chickadee's can be used as a pickaxe, but if you notice it carefully you will see that, without being clumsy, it is very stout, for it is arched enough to give it strength. Of course the chickadee sometimes nests in natural cavities in trees, and Audubon says old woodpeckers' holes are occasionally used, but most writers agree in thinking that it usually makes its own excavation, occasionally in comparatively hard wood. One morning I was hurrying noisily through the underbrush of a clearing to get home in time for breakfast, when suddenly I came face to face with a pair of chickadees. Even then they did not stir, but sat eyeing me calmly for several seconds. I suspected a nest, and when they had flown off, I discovered the opening in a decayed stub close by my side. The stub was a small one, being perhaps 8 or 10 inches in diameter and 4.5 feet high. The entrance was about a foot from the top, and the nest itself a foot or more below this. What a tasteful little structure it was! Although out of sight, it was far prettier than most bird houses on exhibition in the forest. Bits of fresh green moss gave it a dainty air, and brought out the dark gray of the squirrel or rabbit fur that made it snug and warm. I was tempted to wonder where the fur came from. Had this innocent chickadee tweaked it out of the back of some preoccupied animal? Perhaps the demure little recluse has a spice of wickedness after all, and its satisfaction in its secure retreat has something of exultant mischief in it. In any case, it sometimes takes unfair advantage, for this fall I saw a chickadee deliberately lying in wait for his breakfast, just as a spider would. I was passing a Norway spruce when I caught sight of him pecking away on the underside of one of the lower branches. Soon he pulled out a large white chrysalis-like ball, flew up on a branch, and sat there till he disposed of it. Then he went back and hung himself upside down to the branch, just below the place where the first morsel had come from. Balder, my big Newfoundland, and I were within 5 feet of the little rogue, but he did not care for that. There he clung for as much as 2 or 3 minutes, perfectly motionless, except when he turned his head to give us a preoccupied look. Then suddenly he picked down and drew out a small white worm, and flew up into the branch with a triumphant little cry, as much as to say, "Ha, ha, I got you after all." End of Black-capped Chickadee, Titmouse by Florence A. Merriam. Recording by Cynthia Malone, Sartell, Minnesota.
Why the Chickadee Goes Crazy Once a Year, from Johnny Bear and Other Stories, from Lives of the Hunted, by Ernest, Thompson, Seton. Coffee Break Collection, number 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Why the Chickadee Goes Crazy Once a Year, published September 1893 in Our Animal Friends, the organ of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. A long time ago, when there was no winter in the North, the chickadees lived merrily in the woods with their relatives, and cared for nothing but to get all the pleasure possible out of their daily life in the thickets. But at length Mother Carey sent them all a warning that they must move to the south, for hard frost and snow were coming on their domains, with starvation close behind. The nuthatches and other cousins of the chickadees took this warning seriously, and set about learning how and when to go. But Tom Tit, who led his brothers, only laughed and turned a dozen wheels around a twig that served him for a trapeze. "Go to the south?" said he. "Not I. I am too well contented here, and as for frost and snow, I never saw any, and have no faith in them." But the nuthatches and kinglets were in such a state of bustle that at length the chickadees did catch a little of the excitement, and left off play for a while to question their friends. And they were not pleased with what they learned, for it seemed that all of them were to make a journey that would last many days, and the little kinglets were actually going as far as the Gulf of Mexico. Besides, they were to fly by night, in order to avoid their enemies the hawks, and the weather at this season was sure to be stormy. So the chickadees said it was all nonsense, and went off in a band, singing and chasing one another through the woods. But their cousins were in earnest. They bustled about making their preparations, and learned beforehand what it was necessary for them to know about the way. The great wide river running southward, the moon at height, and the trumpeting of the geese were to be their guides, and they were to sing as they flew in the darkness, to keep from being scattered. The noisy, rollicking chickadees were noisier than ever as the preparations went on, and made sport of their relatives, who were now gathered in great numbers in the woods along the river. And at length, when the proper time of the moon came, the cousins arose in a body and flew away in the gloom. The chickadees said that the cousins all were crazy, made some good jokes about the Gulf of Mexico, and then dashed away in a game of tag through the woods, which, by the by, seemed rather deserted now, while the weather, too, was certainly turning remarkably cool. At length the frost and snow really did come, and the chickadees were in a woeful case. Indeed, they were frightened out of their wits, and dashed hither and thither, seeking in vain for someone to set them aright on the way to the south. They flew wildly about the woods till they were truly crazy. I suppose there was not a squirrel hole or a hollow log in the neighborhood that some Chickadee did not enter to inquire if this was the Gulf of Mexico. But no one could tell anything about it. No one was going that way, and the great river was hidden under ice and snow. About this time a messenger from Mother Carey was passing with a message to the caribou in the far north, but all he could tell the Chickadees was that he could not be their guide, as he had no instructions, and at any rate he was going the other way. Besides, he told them they had had the same notice as their cousins, whom they had called crazy, and from what he knew of Mother Carey, they would probably have to brave it out here all through the snow, not only now, but in all following winters, so they might as well make the best of it. This was sad news for the tomtits, but they were brave little fellows, and seeing they could not help themselves, they set about making the best of it. Before a week had gone by, they were in their usual good spirits again, scrambling about the twigs or chasing one another as before. They had still the assurance that winter would end. So filled were they with this idea that even at its commencement, when a fresh blizzard came on, they would gleefully remark to one another that it was a sign of spring, and one or another of the band would lift his voice in the sweet little chant that we all know so well. Spring soon, spring soon. Another would take it up and re-echo, spring coming, spring coming. And they would answer and repeat the song until the dreary woods rang again with the good news, and people learned to love the brave little bird that sets his face so cheerfully to meet so hard a case. But to this day, when the chill wind blows through the deserted woods, the chickadees seem to lose their wits for a few days, and dart into all sorts of odd and dangerous places. They may then be found in great cities, or open prairies, cellars, chimneys, and hollow logs. And the next time you find one of the wanderers in any such place, be sure to remember that Tomtit goes crazy once a year, and probably went into his strange retreat in search of the Gulf of Mexico. End of Why the Chickadee Goes Crazy Once a Year, from Johnny Bear and Other Stories, from Lives of the Hunted, by Ernest Thompson Seton.
The Courtship of Mr. Stork and Miss Heron, by Abbie Farwell Brown. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Courtship of Mr. Stork and Miss Heron. This is a very good story to read at night, just before going to sleep. And if you ask why, I must only tell you that you will find out before you reach the end of the tale. There was once a heron, a pretty long-legged, slender lady heron, who lived in the mushy-squishy, wady-shady swamp. The lady heron lived in her swamp all alone, earning her living by catching little fish, and she was very happy, never dreaming that she was lonesome, for no one had told her what lonesome was. She loved to go wading in the cool waters. She loved to catch the little fish who swam by unsuspectingly, while she stood still upon one leg, pretending to think about something 1,000 miles away. And she loved to look at her slender, long-legged blue reflection in the water, for the lady heron was just a little bit vain. Now, one day Mr. Stork came flying over the mushy-squishy, wady-shady swamp where the heron lived, and he too saw the reflection in the water, and he said to himself, "My, how pretty she is! I wonder I never noticed her before." and how lonesome she must be there all by herself in such a nasty, moist, mushy, squishy old swamp. I will invite her to come and share my nice, warm, dry nest on the chimney top. For to tell the truth, I am growing lonely up there all by myself. Why should we not make a match of it, we two long-legged creatures?" Mr. Stork went home to his house, which he set prettily in order, for he never dreamed but that the Lady Heron would accept his offer at the very first croak. He preened his feathers and made himself as lovely as he could, and forthwith off he flew with his long legs dangling, straight to the wady, shady swamp where Miss Heron was standing on one leg, waiting for her supper to get itself caught. "Ahem," croaked Mr. Stork, waving his wing politely. "Good evening, Miss Heron. Fine weather we are having, eh? But how horribly moist it is down here. I should think that your nice straight legs would grow crooked with rheumatism. Now, I have a comfortable dry house on the roof." "Poof!" grunted Miss Heron disdainfully. But Mr. Stork pretended not to hear, and went on with his remarks. "A nice dry house, which I should be glad to have you share with me. Come, Miss Heron. Here I am, a lonely old bachelor, and here you are, a lonely old maid." "Lonely old maid, indeed!" screamed the Heron, interrupting him. "I don't know what it is to be lonely. Get along with you." And she splashed water on him with her wings, she was so indignant. Poor Mr. Stork felt very crestfallen at this reception of his well-meaning invitation. He turned about and stalked away toward his nest upon the roof, without so much as saying good-bye to the lady. But no sooner was he out of sight than Miss Heron began to think. He had said that she was lonely. Was she lonely? Well, perhaps he ought to know better than she, for he was a very wise bird. Perhaps she was lonely, now that she came to think of it. However, there was no reason why she should go to live in that stupid dry old nest on the housetop. Why could he not come to dwell in her lovely, mushy, squishy, wady, shady swamp? That would be very pleasant, for he was a good sort of fellow with nice long legs, and there were fish enough in the water for two. Besides, he could then do the fishing for the family, and, moreover, there would then be two to admire her reflection in the water. Yes, her mind was made up. She would invite him. She glanced down at her reflection and settled some of the feathers which her fit of temper had ruffled out of order. Then off she started in pursuit of Mr. Stork. Mr. Stork had not gone far, for a sad, rejected lover is a dawdling creature, and so she came up with him long before he was in sight of his nest. "Good evening, Mr. Stork," said the lady nervously. I've been thinking over what you said to me just now, and I have concluded that perhaps I was a bit hasty. To tell you the truth, sir, I am a trifle lonely, now that you suggest the thought to me, and it would be very agreeable to have pleasant company. I am ready, sir, to agree to your proposal. But of course I cannot think of changing my abode. My swamp is the most beautiful home that a maiden ever knew, and I could not give it up for anyone. As to your ugly old nest on the chimney-top, bah! I cannot endure the idea with patience." Mr. Stork was gradually stiffening into an angry attitude, but she did not notice. "Now you can come and live in my swamp," Miss Heron went on warmly, "and you will be very welcome to catch fish for me and to look in my mirror. It will be very nice indeed." "Nice?" croaked the Stork. "I should say as much. What can you be thinking of, miss? I to give up my comfortable home on the housetop, close by the warm chimney, and go to live in that disgusting, mushy, squishy bog of yours? Ha, ha! That is really too ridiculous. I bid you good morning." And with an elaborate bow he turned his back and flew away. Miss Heron flounced back to her swamp, mortified because she had left it to propose terms to so ungallant a fellow. But hardly had she begun her tardy supper when once more Mr. Stork's shadow darkened the mirror before her, and once more she heard his apologetic croak. "Ahem," he began. I hope I find you well, Miss Heron. I have been considering your last most condescending words, and I find that I have been hasty. You are so good as to express a belief that I should make a pleasant companion. So I should. And as for you, he bowed gallantly, one can readily imagine the charm of your society. Come, then, Miss Heron, why should we not make a happy couple, if we can only arrange this one little foolish matter? Be my wife, and come live with me in my lovely nest. But at this word Miss Heron uttered a little scream, and cried, Be off with you, you villain! Leave my premises instantly! And she waved her wings so fiercely that once more Mr. Stork took to his, and flapped away to his home. Now when he had gone, Miss Heron found that she had been bad-tempered, and she thought how pleasantly they might have arranged the matter if only she had been more moderate. So she spread her beautiful blue wings and flew to the housetop where Mr. Stork lived, and perching on the chimney, she said, Oh, Mr. Stork, I was bad-tempered and impolite, and I beg your pardon. Let us be friends once more. Leave this hot, old, stupid housetop, and come live in my cool, moist, wady, shady swamp, and I will be your very loving little wife. But the stork arose in his nest, flapping his wings crossly, and cried, Be off, you baggage! Don't come here to insult my beautiful house. Be off, I say, to your mushy, squishy, rheumaticky bog. I want no more of you. So the heron flew back disconsolately to the watery swamp, where she began to feel very lonely indeed. And the stork, too, began to feel very lonely indeed, and he was sorry that he had been rude to the lady. Presently, once more he came flapping to the mushy, squishy marsh, where he found Miss Heron just ready to go to sleep. Oh, dear Miss Heron, he cried, I made a great mistake, and said things for which I am truly sorry. Do come and be my loving wife, as you promised, and we will live happily ever after on the chimney-top, far above the other birds, and I will never be cross again. But the heron answered, Away with you! I want to go to sleep. I am tired of your croaking voice. Leave me alone. So the stork flew away in a huff. But the heron could not sleep, she was so lonely. So she rose, and flying through the still night air, came again to the stork's high-built nest. Come, Storky dear, she said in her sweetest tone, come home to your dear wife's house in the wady, shady, mushy, squishy marsh, and I will be good. But the stork pretended to be asleep, and only snored and replied. So the heron flew home in a huff. But the stork could not truly sleep, he was so lonely, so he rose, and flying through the still night air, came again to the heron's home in the marsh. Come, my dear, he said, come home to your dear husband's house, and I will be good. But the heron made no answer, pretending to be asleep. So the stork flew home in a huff. But the heron could not sleep, she was so lonely, so she rose at break of day, and flying through the cool morning air, came again to the stork's nest. Come, Storky dear, she said, come home to your dear wife's house, and I will be good. But the stork did not answer, he was so angry, so the heron flew home in a huff. And if you are not asleep when you get as far as this, you may go on with the story by yourself, perfectly well. You may go on just as long as you can keep awake, for the tale has no end at all. It is still going on to this very day. The stork still lives lonely on his housetop, and the heron still lives lonely in her marsh, growing lonelier and lonelier, both of them. But because they have no tact, they are never able to agree to the same thing at the same time, and they keep flying back and forth, saying the same things over and over and over and over. End of The Courtship of Mr. Stork and Miss Heron by Abbie Farwell Brown.
The Crow by Florence A. Merriam. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The despised crow is one of our most interesting birds. His call is like the smell of the brown furrows in spring. Life is more sound and wholesome for it. Though the crow has no song, what a variety of notes and tones he can boast. In vocabulary, he is a very Shakespeare among birds. Listening to a family of Frenchmen, though you don't know a word of French, you easily guess the temper and drift of their talk, and so it is in listening to crows' tone, inflection, gesture, all betray their secrets. One morning last October, I caught in this way a spicy chapter in crow family discipline. I was standing in a meadow of rich aftermath, lying between a stony pasture and a small piece of woods, when a young crow flew over my head, cawing softly to himself. He flew straight west, toward the pasture for several seconds. Then, as if an idea had come to him, turned his head and neck around in an intelligent crow fashion, circled back to the woods, lit, and called vociferously to 3 other crows till they came over across the pasture. After making them all circle over my head, perhaps merely as a blind, he took them back to his perch where he wanted them to go beech nutting or something else. Whatever it was, they evidently scorned his childishness, for they flew back to their tree across the field as fast as they had come. This put him in a pet, and he would not budge, but sat there sputtering like a spoiled child. To everything he said, whether in complaining or teasing tone, the same gruff paternal caw came back from the pasture. "Come along," it seemed to say. To this the refractory son would respond, "I won't." They kept it up for several minutes, but at last paternal authority conquered, and the big boy, making a wide detour, flew slowly and reluctantly back to his family. He lit on a low branch under them, and when the father gave a gruff, "I should think it was time you came," he defiantly shook his tail and cleaned his bill. After a few moments he condescended to make a low, half-sullen, half-subdued remark, but when the family all started off again he sat and scolded some time before he would follow them, and I suspect he compromised matters then only because he did not want to be left behind. The intelligence of the crow Leas become a platitude, but when we hear of his cracking clams by dropping them on a fence, coming to roost with the hens in the cold weather, and in the case of a tame crow, opening a door by lighting on the latch, his originality is a surprise. A family near here had much merriment over the gambols of a pet crow named Jim. Whenever he saw the gardener passing to and fro between the house and garden, he would fly down from the trees, light on his hat, and ride back and forth. He liked to pick the bright blossoms, particularly pansies and scarlet geraniums, and would not only steal bright-colored worsted and ribbons, but tear all the yellow covers from any novels he came across. When any one of them went to the vegetable garden, he showed the most commendable eagerness to help with the work, being anxious to pick whatever was wanted, from raspberries and currants to little cucumbers gathered for pickling. The sight of the big black puppy waddling along, wagging high in air a long black tail, incongruously finished off with a tipping of white hairs, was too much for Jim's sobriety. Down he would dive, give a nip at the hairs, and be gravely seated on a branch, just out of reach by the time Bruno had turned to snap at him. Let the puppy move on a step, and down the mischief would come again, and so the two would play sometimes for more than half an hour at a time. Then again the joke would take a more practical turn, for instead of flying overhead when Bruno looked back, Jim would steal the bone the puppy had been gnawing. The crow was happy as long as any one would play with him, and never tired of flying low over the ground with the string dangling from his bill for the children to run after. Another favorite play was to hold on to a string or small stick with his bill while someone lifted him up by it as a baby is tossed by its arms. He would even hold on and let you, swing him around your head. He was never daunted, and when the toddling 2-year-old would get too rough in her play and strike at him with her stick, he would either catch the hem of her pinafore and hold on till she ran away, or would try scaring her, rushing at her, his big black wings spread out and his bill wide open. One day his pluck was thoroughly tested. Hearing loud calls of distress coming from the lawn, the gardener rushed across and found Jim lying on his back, his claw tightly gripping the end of one of the wings of a large hawk that, surprised and terrified by this turn of the tables, was struggling frantically to get away. Jim held him as tight as a vice and only loosened his grasp to give his enemy into the gardener's hands. After letting go, he submitted to the victor's reward, letting his wounds be examined and his bravery extolled, while he was carried about, wearing a most consciously heroic air, it must be confessed, for due celebration of the victory. End of The Crow by Florence A. Merriam.
The Gates Opening, from Complete Prose Works by Walt Whitman. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in June 2023. The Gates Opening, April 6th. Palpable spring indeed are the indications of it. I am sitting in bright sunshine at the edge of the creek, the surface just rippled by the wind. All is solitude, morning freshness, negligence. For companions, my 2 kingfishers, sailing, winding, darting, dipping, sometimes capriciously separate, then flying together. I hear their guttural twittering again and again, for a while nothing but that peculiar sound. As noon approaches, other birds warm up. The reedy notes of the robin, and the musical passage of 2 parts, one a clear, delicious gurgle, with several other birds I cannot place. To which is joined, yes, I just hear it, one low purr, at intervals from some impatient hylas at the pond edge. The sibilant murmur of a pretty stiff breeze now and then through the trees. Then a poor little dead leaf, long frost-bound, whirls from somewhere up aloft, in one wild escaped freedom spree in space and sunlight, and then dashes down to the waters, which hold it closely and soon drown it out of sight. The bushes and trees are yet bare, but the beeches have their wrinkled yellow leaves of last season's foliage largely left, frequent cedars and pines yet green, and the grass not without proofs of coming fullness. And over all a wonderfully fine dome of clear blue, the play of light coming and going, and great fleeces of white clouds swimming so silently. The common earth, the soil. The soil, too. Let others pen and ink the sea, the air, as I sometimes try. But now I feel to choose the common soil for theme, naught else. The brown soil here, just between winter close and opening spring and vegetation, the rain shower at night and the fresh smell next morning, the red worms wriggling out of the ground, the dead leaves, the incipient grass, and the latent life underneath, the effort to start something. Already in sheltered spots some little flowers, the distant emerald show of winter wheat and the rye fields, the yet naked trees with clear interstices giving prospects hidden in summer, the tough fallow and the plough team, and the stout boy whistling to his horses for encouragement, and there the dark fat earth in long slanting stripes upturned. Birds and birds and birds. A little later, bright weather, an unusual melodiousness these days, last of April and first of May, from the blackbirds, indeed all sorts of birds, darting, whistling, hopping, or perched on trees. Never before have I seen, heard, or been in the midst of, and got so flooded and saturated with them and their performances as this current month. Such oceans, such successions of them. Let me make a list of those I find here. Blackbirds, plenty. Meadowlarks, plenty. Ringdoves, catbirds, plenty. Owls, cuckoos, woodpeckers, pond snipes, plenty. Kingbirds, chewinks, crows, plenty. Quawks, wrens, ground robins, kingfishers, ravens, quails, gray snipe, turkey buzzards, eagles, hen hawks, high-holes, yellowbirds, herons, thrushes, tits, reed birds, wood pigeons. Early came the bluebirds, meadowlark, killdeer, white-bellied swallow, plover, sandpiper, robin, Wilson's thrush, woodcock, flicker. End of The Gates Opening by Walt Whitman.
How the Mousebird Made Fun of the Brownie by Ernest, Thompson, Seton. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Pyle. How the Mousebird Made Fun of the Brownie. Once there was a conceited brownie who thought he could do more things, and do them better, than any other of his people. He had not tried yet, for he was very young, but he said he was going to do them some day. One morning a sly old brownie, really making fun of him, said, "Why don't you catch that Phoebe bird? It is quite easy if you put a little salt on his tail." Away went smarty Brownie to try, but the Phoebe would not sit still, and the brownie came back saying he bobbed his tail so the salt would not stay on. "Well," said the sly old brownie, "there is a little mouse bird whose tail never bobs. You can easily catch him, for you see, he does not even fly, but crawls like a mouse up the tree." And he pointed to a little brown creeper. But this time the young brownie knew that the others were laughing at him, so he said rather hotly, "I'll just show you right now." He took an acorn cup full of salt and went after the mouse bird. It was at the bottom of the big tree, creeping up round and round, as if on a spiral staircase, and the brownie began to climb in the same way. But every little while the climber had to stop and rest. This had strange results, for there is a law in Brownie Land, that wherever one of the little people stops to sit down or rest, a toadstool must spring up for him to sit on. So the track of the brownie up the trunk became one long staircase of toadstool steps, some close, some far apart, but each showing where the brownie had rested. They came closer together toward the top, where the brownie had got tired, but he was coming very near to the creeper now. He got his pinch of salt all ready, and his friends down below kept calling and jeering, "Now you've got him! Now is your chance!" But just as he was going to leap forward and drop the salt on its tail, the creeper gave a tiny little laugh like tee-tee-tee, spread its wings, for it could fly very well, and sailed away to the bottom of the next tree to do the spiral staircase all over again, while Smarty Brownie was so mad that he jumped to the ground and hid away from his friends for 2 days. When he came back, he did not talk quite so much as he used to. But to this day, you can see the staircase of toadstools on the tree trunks, where the brownie went up. End of How the Mousebird Made Fun of the Brownie by Ernest, Thompson, Seton.
Hummingbird, from Birds, Beasts, and Flowers by D.H. Lawrence. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Recording by Kevin Lee Smith, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hummingbird. I can imagine in some other world, primeval dumb, far back, in that most awful stillness that only gasped and hummed. Hummingbirds raced down the avenues. Before anything had a soul, while life was a heave of matter, half inanimate. This little bit chipped off in brilliance, and went whizzing through the slow, vast, succulent stems. I believe there were no flowers then, in the world where the hummingbird flashed ahead of creation. I believe he pierced the slow vegetable veins with his long beak. Probably he was big, as mosses and little lizards, they say, were once big. Probably he was a jabbing, terrifying monster. We look at him through the wrong end of the long telescope of time. Luckily for us. End of Hummingbird, from Birds, Beasts, and Flowers by D.H. Lawrence. Recording by Kevin Lee Smith, Minneapolis, Minnesota. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Hummingbird by Bradford Torrey. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Merritt. The Hummingbird. Hummingbirds are found only in America and on the islands near it. They are of many kinds, but only one kind is ever seen in the eastern United States. This is known as the ruby-throated hummingbird because of a splendid red throat patch worn by the male. To speak more exactly, the patch is red only in some lights. You see it in one instant as black as a coal, and the next instant it flashes like a coal on fire. This ornament, a real jewel, with the lovely shining green of the bird's back, makes him an object of great beauty. Everyone knows him, or would do so, only that some people confuse him with bright-colored, long-tongued hummingbird moths that are seen hovering, mostly in the early evening, over the flowers of the garden. The ruby-throat spends the winter south of the United States. He arrives in Florida in March, but does not reach New England till near the middle of May. Many persons seem to imagine that the hummer lives on the wing. They have never seen one sitting still, they say. But the truth is that hummingbirds pass but a small part of the time in the air. They are so very small, however, that they are easily overlooked on a branch of a tree, and the average person never notices them except when the hum of their wings attracts his attention. One of the prettiest sights in the world is a hummingbird hovering before a blossom, his wings vibrating so fast as to make a mist about him, and his long needle of a bill probing the flower with quick, eager thrusts. All his movements are of lightning-like rapidity, and even while your eyes are on him, he is gone like a flash. You cannot say whither. The hummingbird's nest is built on a branch of a tree, saddled on it, and it is not very hard to find after you have once seen one, and so have learned precisely what to look for. Generally, it is placed well out towards the end of the limb. I have found it on pitch pines in the woods, on roadside maples, shade trees, and especially in apple and pear orchards. The mother bird is very apt to betray its whereabouts by buzzing about the head of anyone who comes near it. Last May, for example, I stopped in the middle of the road to listen for the voice of a house wren, when I caught, instead, the buzz and squeak of a hummer. Turning my gaze upward, I saw her fly to a half-built nest on a maple branch directly over my head. The nest is a tiny thing, looking for size and shape like a cup out of a child's toy tea set. Its walls are thick, and on the outside are covered, shingled, we may say, with bits of gray lichen, which help to make the nest look like nothing more than a knot. Whether they are put on for that purpose or by way of ornament is more than I can tell. The bird always lays 2 white eggs, about as large as peas. The young ones stay in the nest for 3 weeks, more or less, till they are fully grown and fledged and perfectly well able to fly. I once saw one take his first flight, and a great venture it seemed. All these 3 weeks, and for another week afterward, the mother, no father is present, has her hands full to supply the little things with food, which she gives them from her crop, thrusting her long, sharp bill clean down their throats in the process, in a way to make a looker-on shiver. The only note I have ever heard from the ruby throat is a squeak, which seems to be an expression of nervousness or annoyance, and is uttered whenever an intruder, a man, a cat, a strange bird, comes near the tree in which her treasures are hidden. Hummingbirds sometimes fly into open windows and are caught. At such times they become tame almost at once, but it is difficult, if not impossible, to keep them alive in captivity, and it is cruel to attempt it, except when the little creature is injured and plainly unable to look out for itself. A lady of my acquaintance discovered a hummingbird under her piazza. It had flown in by accident, probably, and now was darting to and fro in a frantic attempt to get out. The piazza was open on 3 sides, to be sure, but the frightened bird kept up against the ceiling, and of course found itself walled in. Fearful that it would injure itself, the lady brought a broom and tried to force it to come down, and so discover its way out. But it was only the more scared. Then a happy thought came to her. She went to the garden, plucked a few flowers, and going back to the piazza, set them down for the bird to see. Instantly it flew toward them, and as it did so, it saw the open world without, and away it went. Another lady wrote me once a very pretty story of a hummer that came and probed a nasturtium which she held in her hand. It is wonderful to think that so tiny a bird, born in New England or in Canada in June, should travel to Cuba and Central America in the autumn, and the next spring find its way back again to its birthplace. End of The Hummingbird by Bradford Torrey. If You Had Wings by Dallas Lore Sharp. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Merritt. If you had wings. If you had wings, why, of course you would wear feathers instead of clothes, and you might be a crow. And then, of course, you would steal corn and run the risk of getting 3 of your big wing feathers shot away. All winter long, and occasionally during the spring, I have seen one of my little band of crows flying about with a big hole in his wing. At least 3 of his large wing feathers gone, shot away probably last summer, which causes him to fly with a list or limp, like an automobile with a flattened tire, or a ship with a shifted ballast. Now for nearly a year, that crow has been hobbling about on 1 whole and 1/2 wing, trusting to luck to escape his enemies, until he can get 3 new feathers to take the places of those that are missing. Well, why doesn't he get them, you ask? If you were that crow, how would you get them? Can a crow, by taking thought, add 3 new feathers to his wing? Certainly not. That crow must wait until wing feather season comes again, just as an apple tree must wait until apple growing season comes to hang its boughs with luscious fruit. The crow has nothing to do with it. His wing feathers are supplied by nature once a year, after the nesting time, and if a crow loses any of them, even if right after the new feathers had been supplied, that crow will have to wait until the season for wing feathers comes around once more. If indeed he can wait, and does not fall a prey to hawk or owl, or the heavy odds of winter. But nature is not going to be hurried on that account, nor caused to change one jot or tittle from her wise and methodical course. The Bible says that the hairs of our heads are numbered. So are the feathers on a crow's body. Nature knows just how many there are altogether, how many there are of each sort. Primaries, secondaries, tertials, greater coverts, middle coverts, lesser coverts, and scapulars in the wing. Just how each sort is arranged. Just when each sort is to be molted and renewed. If Master Crow does not take care of his clothes, then he will have to go without until the time for a new suit comes. For Mother Nature won't patch them up as your mother patches up yours. But now this is what I want you to notice and think about. That just as an apple falls according to a great law of nature, so a bird's feathers fall according to a law of nature. The moon is appointed for seasons. The sun knoweth his going down. And so light and insignificant a thing as a bird's feather not only is appointed to grow in a certain place at a certain time, but also knoweth its falling off. Nothing could look more haphazard, certainly, than the way a hen's feathers seem to drop off at molting time. The most forlorn, undone, abject creature about the farm is the half-molted hen. There's one in the chicken yard now, so nearly naked that she really is ashamed of herself, and so miserably helpless that she squats in a corner all night, unable to reach the low poles of the roost. It is a critical experience with the hen, this molting of her feathers, and were it not for the protection of the yard, it would be a fatal experience. So easily could she be captured. Nature seems to have no hand in the business at all. If she has, then what a mess she's making of it. But pick up the hen, study the falling of the feathers carefully, and lo, here is law and order, every feather as important to nature as a star, every quill as a planet, and the old white hen as mightily looked after by nature as the round sphere of the universe. Once a year, usually after the nesting season, it seems a physical necessity for most birds to renew their plumage. We get a new suit, some of us, because our old ones wear out. That is the most apparent cause for the new annual suit of the birds. Yet with them, as with some of us, the feathers go out of fashion, and then the change of feathers is a mere matter of style, it seems. For severe and methodical as Mother Nature must be, and what mother or teacher or ruler who has great things to do and a multitude of little things to attend to must not be severe and methodical. Severe, I say, as Mother Nature must be in looking after her children's clothes, she has for all that a real motherly heart, it seems. For see how she looks after their wedding garments, giving to most of the birds a new suit, gay and gorgeous, especially to the bridegrooms, as if fine feathers did make a fine bird. Or does she do all of this to meet the fancy of the bride, as the scientists tell us? Whether so or not, it is a fact that among the birds it is the bridegroom who is adorned for his wife, and sometimes the fine feathers come by a special molt, an extra suit for him. Take Bobolink, for instance. He has 2 complete molts a year, 2 new suits, one of them his wedding suit. Now, as I write, I hear him singing over the meadow, a jet black, white, and cream buff lover, most strikingly adorned. His wife, down in the grass, looks as little like him as a sparrow looks like a blackbird. For after the breeding season he will molt again, changing color so completely that he and his wife and children will all look alike, all like sparrows, and will even lose their names, flying south now under the name of reed birds. Bobolink passes the winter in Brazil, and in the spring, just before the long northward journey begins, he lays aside his fall traveling clothes and puts on his gay wedding garments and starts north for his bride. But you would hardly know he was dressed to look at him, for strangely enough, he is not black and white, but still colored like a sparrow, as he was in the fall. Apparently he is. Look at him more closely, however, and you will find that the brownish yellow color is all caused by a veil of fine fringes hanging from the edges of the feathers. The bridegroom wearing the wedding veil? Yes, underneath is the black and white and cream buff suit. He starts northward, and by the time he reaches Massachusetts, the fringe veil is worn off and the black and white bobolink appears. Specimens taken after their arrival here still show traces of the brownish-yellow veil. Many birds do not have this early spring molt at all, and with most of those that do, the great feather wings are not then renewed as are bobolinks, but only after the annual molt, after the nesting is done. The great feathers of the wings are, as you know, the most important feathers a bird has, and the shedding of them is so serious a matter that nature has come to make the change according to the habits and needs of the birds. With most birds, the body feathers begin to go first, then the wing feathers, and last those of the tail. But the shedding of the wing feathers is a very slow and carefully regulated process. In the wild geese and other water birds, the wing feathers drop out with the feathers of the body and go so nearly together that the birds really cannot fly. On land you could catch the birds with your hands, but they keep near or on the water and thus escape, though times have been when it was necessary to protect them at this season by special laws, for bands of men would go into their nesting marshes and kill them with clubs by hundreds. The shedding of the feathers brings many risks to the birds, but nature leaves none of her children utterly helpless. The geese at this time cannot fly because their feathers are gone, but they can swim, and so get away from most of their natural enemies. On the other hand, the hawks that hunt by wing, and must have wings always in good feather, or else perish, lose their feathers so slowly that they never feel their loss. It takes a hawk nearly a year to get a complete change of wing feathers, one or two dropping out from each wing at a time, at long intervals apart. Then here is the gosling, that goes 6 weeks in down before it gets its first feathers, which it sheds within a few weeks in the fall, whereas the young quail is born with quills so far grown that it is able to fly almost as soon as it is hatched. These are real, mature feathers, but the bird is young and soon outgrows these first flight feathers, so they are quickly lost and new ones come. This goes on till fall, several molts occurring the first summer to meet the increasing weight of the little quail's growing body. I said that nature was severe and methodical, and so she is, where she needs to be. So severe that you are glad, perhaps, that you are not a crow. But nature, like every wise mother, is severe only where she needs to be. A crow's wing feathers are vastly important to him. Let him take care of them, for they are the best feathers made and are put in to stay a year. But a crow's tail feathers are not so vastly important to him. He could go on if, like the rabbit in the old song, he had no tail at all. In most birds, the tail is a kind of balance or steering gear, and not of equal importance with the wings. Nature, consequently, seems to have attached less importance to the feathers of the tail. They are not so firmly set, nor are they of the same quality or kind. For, unlike the wing feathers, if a tail feather is lost through accident, it is made good, no matter when. How do you explain that? Do you think I believe that old story of the birds roosting with their tails out? So that because of generations of lost tails, those feathers now grow expecting to be plucked by some enemy, and therefore have only a temporary hold. The normal, natural way, of course, is to replace a lost feather with a new one as soon as possible. But in order to give extra strength to the wing feathers, nature has found it necessary to check their frequent change. And so complete is the check that the annual molt is required to replace a single one. The Japanese have discovered the secret of this check, and are able by it to keep certain feathers in the tails of their cocks growing until they reach the enormous length of 10 to 12 feet. My crow, it seems, lost his 3 feathers last summer, just after his annual molt. The 3 broken shafts he carries still in his wing, and must continue to carry, as the stars must continue their courses, until those 3 feathers have rounded out their cycle to the annual molt. The universe of stars and feathers is a universe of law, of order, and of reason, and of if you had feathers.
Kuratko the Terrible by Parker Hoysted Fillmore. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. Kuratko the Terrible. There once was an old couple who had no children. "If only we had a chick or a child of our own," grandmother used to say. "Think how we could pet it and take care of it." But grandfather always answered, "Not at all. We are very well off as we are." At last the old black hen in the barnyard hatched out a chick. Grandmother was delighted. "See, Grandpa," she said, "now we have a chick of our own." But grandfather shook his head doubtfully. "I don't like the looks of that chick. There's something strange about it." But grandmother wouldn't listen. To her the chick seemed everything it should be. She called it Kuratko, and petted it and pampered it as though it were an only child. Kuratko grew apace, and soon he developed an awful appetite. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" he shouted at all hours of the day. "I'm hungry. Give me something to eat." "You mustn't feed that chick so much," grandfather grumbled. "He's eating us out of house and home." But grandmother wouldn't listen. She fed Kuratko and fed him, till sure enough there came a day when there was nothing left for herself and the old man. That was a nice how-do-you-do. Grandmother sat working at her spinning wheel, trying to forget that she was hungry, and grandfather sat on his stool nearby, too cross to speak to her. And then, quite as though nothing were the matter, Kuratko strutted into the room, flapped his wings, and crowed. "Cock-a-doodle-doo! I'm hungry. Give me something to eat." "Not another blessed thing will I ever feed you, you greedy chick," grandfather shouted. "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Kuratko answered. "Then I'll just eat you." With that he made one peck at grandfather and swallowed him down, stool and all. "Oh, Kuratko," grandmother cried, "where's Grandpa?" "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Kuratko remarked. "I'm still hungry. I think I'll eat you." And with that he made one peck at grandmother and swallowed her down, spinning wheel and all. Then that terrible chick went strutting down the road, crowing merrily. He met a washerwoman at work over her wash-tub. "Good gracious, Kuratko," the woman cried, "what a big crop you've got." "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Kuratko said. "I should think my crop was big, for haven't I just eaten grandmother's spinning wheel and all, and grandfather's stool and all? but I'm still hungry, so now I'm going to eat you." Before the poor woman knew what was happening, Kuratko made one peck at her and swallowed her down, wash tub and all. Then he strutted on down the road, crowing merrily. Presently he came to a company of soldiers. "Good gracious, Kuratko," the soldiers cried, "what a big crop you've got!" "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Kuratko replied. "I should think my crop was big, for haven't I just eaten a washerwoman tub and all, grandmother's spinning wheel and all, and grandfather's stool and all? But I'm still hungry, so now I'm going to eat you." Before the soldiers knew what was happening, Kuratko pecked at them and swallowed them down, bayonets and all, one after another, just like so many grains of wheat. Then that terrible chick went on strutting down the road, crowing merrily. Soon he met Cassel the cat. Cassel the cat blinked his eyes and worked his whiskers in surprise. "Good gracious, Kuratko, what a big crop you've got!" "Cock-a-doodle-doo," Kuratko said. "I should think my crop was big, for haven't I just eaten a company of soldiers, bayonets and all, a washerwoman tub and all, grandmother's spinning wheel and all, and grandfather's stool and all. But I'm still hungry, so now I'm going to eat you." Before Cassel the cat knew what was happening, Kuratko made one peck at him and swallowed him down. But Cassel the cat was not a person to submit tamely to such an indignity. The moment he found himself inside Kuratko, he unsheathed his claws and began to scratch and to tear, and he worked until he had torn a great hole in Kuratko's crop. At that, Kuratko, the terrible chick, when he tried again to crow, toppled over dead. Then Cassel, the cat, jumped out of Kuratko's crop. After him, the company of soldiers marched out, and after them the washerwoman with her tub, grandmother with her spinning wheel, and grandfather with his stool. And they all went about their business. Cassel the cat followed grandmother and grandfather home, and begged them to give him Kuratko for his dinner. "You may have him for all of me," grandfather said, "but ask grandmother. He was her little pet, not mine." "Indeed you may have him," grandmother said. "I see now grandfather was right. Kuratko was certainly an ungrateful chick, and I never want to hear his name again." So Cassel the cat had a wonderful dinner, and to this day, when he remembers it, he licks his chops and combs his whiskers. End of Kuratko the Terrible by Parker Hoysted Fillmore.
Birds Migrating at Midnight by Walt Whitman. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Pyle. Birds Migrating at Midnight. Did you ever chance to hear the midnight flight of birds passing through the air and darkness overhead, and countless armies changing their early or late summer habitat? It is something not to be forgotten. A friend called me up just after 12 last night to mark the peculiar noise of unusually immense flocks migrating north rather late this year. In the silence, shadow, and delicious odor of the hour, the natural perfume belonging to the night alone, I thought it rare music. You could hear the characteristic motion, once or twice the rush of mighty wings, but often a velvety rustle, long drawn out, sometimes quite near, with continual calls and chirps and some song notes. It all lasted from 12 till after 3. Once in a while the species was plainly distinguishable. I could make out the bobolink, tanager, Wilson's thrush, white-crowned sparrow, and occasionally from high in the air came the notes of the plover. End of Birds Migrating at Midnight by Walt Whitman.
The Passage Birds by Walter Richard Cassels. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. Recording by Larry Wilson. Far, far away over land and sea, when winter comes with his cold, cold breath, and chills the flowers to the sleep of death, far, far away over land and sea, like a band of spirits the passage birds flee. Round the old grey spire in the evening calm, no more they circle in sportive glee, hearing the hum of the vesper psalm and the swell of the organ so far below. But far, far away over land and sea, in the still mid-air the swift passage birds go, over the earth that is scarcely seen through the curtain of vapour that waves between, o'er city and hamlet, o'er hill and plain, o'er forest green, and o'er mountain hoar, they flit like shadows and pass the shore, and wing their way o'er the pathless main. There is no rest for the weary wing, no quivering bough where the feet can cling. To the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, the ocean lies with its heaving breast. Within it, without it, there is no rest. The tempest gathers beneath them far, the wind god rides on his battle car, and the roar of the thunder, the lightning flash, breaks on the waves with a sullen crash. But silence reigns where the passage birds fly, and o'er them stretches the clear blue sky. The day wears out, and the starry night hushes the world to sleep, to sleep. The dew shower falls in the still moonlight, and none wake now save those who weep. But rustling on through the starry night, like a band of spirits the passage birds flee, cleaving the darkness above the sea, swift and straight as an arrow's flight. Is the wind their guide through the trackless sky? For here there's no landmark to travel by. The first faint streak of the morning glows like the feeble blush on the budding rose, and in long grey lines the clouds divide and march away with retreating night, whilst the bright gleams of victorious light follow them goldenly far and wide. And when the mists have all passed away and left the heavens serene and clear as an eye that has never shed a tear, and the universe basks in the smile of day, dreamy and still, and the sleepy breeze lazily moves o'er the glassy seas, the passage birds flit o'er the disk of noon like shadows across a mirror's face. For now their journey wanes apace, and the realms of summer they'll enter soon. The land looms far through the waters blue, the land of promise, the land of rest. Through cloud and storm they have travelled true, and joy thrills now in each throbbing breast. Down they sink with a wheeling flight, whilst the song of birds come floating high, and they pass the lark in the sunny sky. But down without pausing, down they fly. Their travel is over, their summer shines bright. End of The Passage Birds by Walter Richard Cassels. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
The Ruby-Throated Hummingbird by Florence A. Merriam. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Did you ever see a hummingbird sitting on the bare branch of a towering tree? Until you have, you will scarcely appreciate what a wee mite of a bird it is. Indeed, I find it hard to think of it as a bird at all. It seems more like a fairy, a glittering fragment of a rainbow, as Audubon calls it, or as someone else has said, like a gem or blossom on pinions. Something too dainty and airy to have even 3 inches of actual length. It seems like the winged spirit of color as it comes humming through the air to hover on the flowers on the piazza, its body like green beryl, and its throat glancing fire. Like Puck, it might boast that it could put a girdle round about the earth in 40 minutes, for while we are wondering at its friendliness, it darts off and is gone like a flash of a diamond. In this vicinity, the garden of Mrs. Bragg seems to be one of the favorite haunts of the hummingbirds, and she has kindly given me some notes on her experiences with them. She says, in confinement, they do not appear to pine for freedom, beating themselves against the wires like other birds, but seem contented and at home. From the first, I kept a pair caged a whole summer, feeding them with water sweetened with honey or sugar. When I put a cup of their food in the cage, they would alight on my fingers, and with their long, flexible tongues suck off the honey I had accidentally spilled. In disposition, they are too pugnacious to live as harmoniously as one would expect or desire, sometimes pursuing one another around the cage with great ferocity and such inconceivable rapidity that their tiny forms seemed resolved into absolute sound. I frequently permitted them to fly about the room for exercise, but they never returned voluntarily to their cage. When caught, they did not resist and struggle, but saw the door in their prison house closed upon them without a complaint. They never had a sick or unhappy day the whole summer, but when the cold days of autumn approached, they began to droop, although their cage was hung in the warmest place in the room. For 3 days they hung suspended to their perches by their feet and did not relax the hold while life lasted. I have found them clinging to vines and shrubbery in that manner on cold mornings after a frost, but though seemingly lifeless, the warmth of the hand would revive them. Some years a few are unaccountably tardy about migrating, and other times they make the mistake of coming too early in spring. Undoubtedly, most of them migrate in August, but with them, as in every other community, there are always some laggards as well as bold pioneers. I once found one in my house on a very cold morning in fall. He was probably on some house plants that had been brought in from the frost the previous night, and was too benumbed with cold to know it. I caught and fed him, as it would have been barbarous to turn him out into the cold. He soon became a great pet, and was tame as a kitten. One day 2 gentlemen entered the room where his cage was hanging, both wearing tall hats. He fell immediately to the bottom of his cage, with wings outspread, eyes closed, body rigid, and with every appearance of death. We took him in our hands and warmed him by the fire. He remained motionless. We decided that those hats had frightened him to death. With a heavy heart I laid him aside, intending to embalm him at my leisure. A few minutes later my friends left the house. Directly after the door closed I heard humming and buzzing in the room. Looking up, there was a bird circling around the room in the most hilarious manner. Who can tell whether his apparent death was not counterfeited? If it was not feigned, why did he revive the moment the door was closed and I was alone? If you capture one out of doors and hold him in your hand, he will practice the same ruse, stretching himself out, stiff and motionless. Thrown off your guard, you stoop to examine your prize when, lo, your hand is empty, and your bird is nearly out of sight before you have time to recover from the astonishment. Towards the humble bee, he manifests the utmost ill will, veritable dog-in-the-manger spirit, driving him away from one flower after another, till the bee in pure desperation turns on his persecutor. There are surely sweets enough for all, and he knows it. Still, it may be possible that his animosity is aroused more by a personal aversion he has to the bee than by more selfish considerations. We give him the benefit of the doubt. He is fond of silence, and will often sit half an hour together on a dead twig, wrapped in the profoundest meditation. Doubtless incessant droning of the bees disturbs his reflections and irritates him beyond endurance. I once had in my garden a ribbon bed of white and rose-colored lemon. Its unsullied beauty was like that of a dream of poetry. Every flower was perfect, with an unsurpassed and delicate loveliness. One sunny morning I observed an unusual number of hummingbirds and bees working among the blossoms. Presently there was a commotion. The hummingbirds had united to drive the bees away, darting at them furiously, uttering at the same time their spiteful piping cries. The bees, intent on seeking their breakfast, at first gave up good-naturedly and flew to some other flower, only to be driven from that a moment later. At length forbearance ceased to be a virtue, and the temper of the apathetic bee was aroused. A fierce battle ensued. They pursued one another round and around that flower bed, over and under and through the flowers, sometimes the birds and then the bees having the vantage. Their rage knew no bounds, and they fought till sheer exhaustion compelled them to desist. Every flower was torn to shreds, not a whole blossom remaining. The nest of the hummingbirds is as delicate as the little creature itself. It is built in the form of a small cup, saddled on a horizontal limb, and covered on the outside with lichens, which make it look like a knob on the branch. The child who discovers a hummingbird's nest is credited with sharp eyes. End of Ruby-Throated Hummingbird by Florence A. Merriam.
The Bird Market by Anton Chekhov. Coffee Break Collection 37, More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Public Domain Scholar. The Bird Market by Anton Chekhov. There's a small square near the monastery of the Holy Bird, which is called Trubnoy, or simply Treboy. There's a market there on Sundays. Hundreds of sheepskins, wadded coats, fur caps, and chimney pot hats swarm there, like crabs in a sieve. There's a sound of the twitter of birds and all sorts of keys, recalling the spring. If the sun is shining and there are no clouds in the sky, the singing of the birds and the smell of hay make a more vivid impression, and this reminder of spring sets one thinking and carries one's fancy far, far away. Along one side of the square there stands a string of wagons. The wagons are loaded not with hay, not with cabbages, nor with beans, but with goldfinches, shishkins, larks, blackbirds, and thrushes, blue tits, bullfinches. All of them are hopping about in rough, homemade cages, twittering and looking with envy at the free sparrows. The goldfinches cost 5 kopecks, the shishkins are rather more expensive, while the value of the other birds is quite indeterminate. How much is a lark? The seller himself does not know the value of a lark. He scratches his head and asks whatever comes into it. A ruble or 3 kopecks, according to the purchaser. There are expensive birds too. A faded old blackbird with most of its feathers plucked out of its tail sits on the dirty perch. He is dignified, grave, and motionless, as a retired general. He has waved his claw in resignation to his captivity long ago, and looks at the blue sky with indifference. Probably owing to this indifference, he is considered a sagacious bird. He is not to be bought for less than 40 kopecks. Schoolboys, workmen, young men in stylish greatcoats, and bird fanciers in incredibly shabby caps, in ragged trousers that are turned up at the ankles, and look as though they had been gnawed by mice, crowd round the birds, splashing through the mud. The young people and the workmen are sold hens for cocks, young birds for old ones. They know very little about birds, but there is no deceiving the bird fancier. He sees and understands his bird from a distance. There is no relying on that bird, a fancier will say, looking into the shishkin's beak and counting the feathers on its tail. He sings now, it's true, but what of that? I sing in company too. No, my boy, shout. Sing to me without company. Sing in solitude if you can. You give me that one yonder that sits and holds its tongue. Give me the quiet one. That one says nothing, so he thinks the more. Among the wagons of birds there are some full of other live creatures. Here you see hares, rabbits, hedgehogs, guinea pigs, polecats. A hare sits sorrowfully nibbling the straw. The guinea pigs shiver with cold, while the hedgehogs look out with curiosity from under their prickles at the public. I have read somewhere, says a post office official in a faded overcoat, looking lovingly at the hare and addressing no one in particular. I have read that some learned man had a cat and a mouse and a falcon and a sparrow, who all ate out of one bowl. It's very possible, sir. The cat must have been beaten, and the falcon, I dare say, had all its tail pulled out. There's no great cleverness in that, sir. A friend of mine had a cat who, saving your presence, used to eat his cucumbers. He thrashed her with a big whip for a fortnight, till he taught her not to. A hare can learn to light matches if you beat it. Does that surprise you? It's very simple. It takes the match in its mouth and strikes it. An animal is like a man. A man's made wiser by beating, and it's the same with a beast. Men in long, full-skirted coats move backwards and forwards in the crowd with cocks and ducks under their arms. The fowls are all lean and hungry. Chickens poke their ugly, mangy-looking heads out of their cages and peck at something in the mud. Boys with pigeons stare into your face and try to detect in you a pigeon fancier. Yes, indeed, it's no use talking to you, someone shouts angrily. You should look before you speak. You call this a pigeon? It is an eagle, not a pigeon. A tall, thin man with a shaven upper lip and side whiskers, who looks like a sick and drunken footman, is selling a snow-white lapdog. The old lapdog whines. She told me to sell the nasty thing, says the footman, with a contemptuous snigger. She's bankrupt in her old age, has nothing to eat, and here now is selling her dogs and cats. She cries and kisses them on their filthy snouts, and then she is so hard up that she sells them. Upon my soul, it is a fact. Buy it, gentlemen. The money is wanted for coffee, but no one laughs. The boy who's standing by screws up one eye and looks at him gravely with compassion. The most interesting of all is the fish section. Some dozen peasants are sitting in a row. Before each of them is a pail. In each pail there is a veritable little hell. There in the thick, greenish waters are swarms of little carp, eels, small fry, water snails, frogs, and newts. Big water beetles with broken legs scurry over the small surface, clambering on the carp and jumping over the frogs. The creatures have a strong hold on life. The frogs climb on the beetles, the newts on the frogs. The dark green tench, as more expensive fish, enjoy an exceptional position. They are kept in a special jar where they can't swim, but still they are not so cramped. The carp is a grand fish. The carp's the fish to keep, Your Honor, plague taken. You can keep him for a year in a pail and he'll live. It's a week since I caught these very fish. Caught them, sir, in Pererva, and have come from there on foot. The carp are 2 kopecks each, the eels are 3, and the minnows are 10 kopecks a dozen. Plague take them. 5 kopecks worth of minnows, sir. Won't you take some worms? The seller thrusts his coarse, rough fingers into the pail and pulls out of it a soft minnow, or a little carp, the size of a nail. Fishing lines, hooks, and tackle are laid out near the pails, and pond worms glow with a crimson light in the sun. An old fancier in a fur cap, iron-rimmed spectacles, and galoshes that look like 2 dreadnoughts walks about by the wagons of birds and the pails of fish. He is, as they call him here, a type. He hasn't a farthing to bless himself with, but in spite of that he haggles, gets excited, and pesters purchasers with advice. He has thoroughly examined all the hares, pigeons, and fish. Examined them in every detail, fixed the kind, the age, and the price of each one of them a good hour ago. He is as interested as a child in the goldfinches, the carp, and the minnows. Talk to him, for instance, about thrushes, and the queer old fellow will tell you things you could not find in any book. He will tell you them with enthusiasm, with passion, and will scold you too for your ignorance. Of goldfinches and bullfinches he is ready to talk endlessly, opening his eyes wide, and gesticulating violently with his hands. He is only to be met here at the market, in the cold weather. In the summer he is somewhere else in the country, catching quails with a bird call, and angling for fish. And here is another type, a very tall, very thin, close-shaven gentleman in dark spectacles, wearing a cap with a cockade, and looking like a Shriner of bygone days. He is a fancier. He is a man of decent position, a teacher in a high school, and that is well known to the abattoir of the market. And they treat him with respect, greet him with bows, and have even invented for him a special title, your scholarship. At Suharev Market, he rummages among the books, and at Trubnoy looks out for good pigeons. Please, sir, the pigeon sellers shout to him, Mr. Schoolmaster, your scholarship. Take notice of my tumblers, your scholarship. Your scholarship is shouted at him from every side. Your scholarship, an urchin repeats somewhere on the boulevard, and his scholarship, apparently quite accustomed to this title, grave and severe, takes a pigeon in both hands, and lifting it above his head, begins examining it, and as he does so, frowns, and looks braver than ever, like a conspirator. At Trubnoy Square, that little bit of Moscow, where animals are so tenderly loved, and where they are so tortured, lives its little life, grows noisy and excited, and the businesslike or pious people who pass by along the boulevard cannot make out what has brought this crowd of people, this medley of caps, fur hats, and chimney pots together, what they are talking about there, what they are buying and selling. End of The Bird Market by Anton Chekhov.
The Wood Peewee, a monograph. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. The Wood Peewee, a monograph. Almost every person living in the country or in the suburbs of a town is familiar with the house peewee, or phoebe bird. It is usually looked upon as the sure harbinger of spring. In my boyhood days, my parents and grandparents were wont to say, "Spring is here, the phoebe is singing." And if blithesomeness of tone and good cheer have anything to do with the advent of the season of song and bursting blossoms, the peewit, as he is often called, must be a true herald and prophet. He seems to carry the subtle essence of spring in his tuneful larynx, and in the graceful sweep of his flight as he pounces upon an insect. It is quite easy to make the transition from his familiar song of Phoebe to the exclamation, "Spring's here," by a little stretch of the fancy. But the phoebe has a woodland relative, a first cousin, with which most persons are not so well acquainted, because he is more retiring in his habits, and seeks out-of-the-way places for his habitat. I refer to the wood peewee. If your eyes and ears are not so sharp as they should be, you may get these two birds confounded. Yet there is no need of making such a blunder. The woodland bird is smaller, slenderer, and of a darker cast than his relative. And besides, there is a marked difference in the musical performance of these birds. The song of the phoebe is sprightly and cheerful, and the syllables are uttered rather quickly, while the whistle of the wood peewee is softer and more plaintive, and is repeated with less emphasis and more deliberation. There is indeed something inexpressibly sad and dreamy about the strain of the wood peewee, especially if heard at a distance in the emerald twilight of the woodland privacies. Mr. Lowell seldom erred in his attempts to characterize the songs and habits of the bird, but in his exquisite poem entitled Phoebe, he certainly must have referred to the wood peewee and not to the phoebe bird, as his description applies to the former but not to the latter. He calls the bird the loneliest of its kind, while the peewit is a familiar species about many a country home. Taking it for granted that he meant the wood peewee, how happy is his description. It is the wee, sad-colored thing, as shy and secret as a maid, that ere inquire the robin's ring, pipes its own name like one afraid. It seems pain-prompted to repeat the story of some ancient ill, but Phoebe, Phoebe, sadly sweet, is all it says, and then is still. Phoebe, it calls, and calls again, and Ovid, could he but have heard, had hung a legendary pain about the memory of the bird. Phoebe is all it has to say, in plaintive cadence, o'er and o'er, like children who have lost their way and know their names, but nothing more. This poetical tribute is certainly very graceful, and would be true to life if the phonetic representation were a little more accurate. Instead of Phoebe, imagine the song to be Peewee or Peewee, and you will gain a clear idea of the minstrelsy of this songster of the wildwood. However, he frequently varies his tone to prevent it becoming monotonous, I opine. He sometimes closes his refrain with the falling inflection or circumflex, and sometimes with the rising, as the mood prompts him. In the former case, the first syllable receives the greater emphasis, and is the more prolonged, and in the latter, this order is precisely reversed. When the last syllable is uttered with the rising circumflex, it is usually, if not always, cut off somewhere abruptly. Moreover, this minstrel often runs the two syllables of the song together, a peculiarity that I have represented in my notes, taken while listening to the song, in this way. Feel-wee. There is a characteristic swing about the melody, that refuses to be caught in the mesh of letters and syllables. In some of the Peewee's vocal efforts, he does not go farther than the end of the first syllable. The song seems to be cut off short, as if the notes had stuck fast in the singer's throat, or as if something had occurred to divert his mind from the song. Perhaps this hiatus is caused by the sudden appearance of an insect glancing by, which attracts the musician's attention. This bird usually chooses a dead twig or limb in the woods as a perch, on which he sits and sings, turning his head from side to side so that no flitting moth may escape him. And what a persistent singer he is! He sings not only in the spring, when other vocalists are in full tune, but also all summer long, never growing disheartened, even when the mercury rises far up into the 90s. What a pleasant companion he has been in my midsummer strolls, as I have wearily patrolled the woods. On the sultriest August days, when all other birds were glad to keep mute, sitting on their shady perches with open mandibles and drooping wings, the dreamful, far-away strain of the wood peewee has drifted, a welcome sound to my ears through the dim aisles. He seems to be a friend in need. How often, when the heat has almost overcome me as I pursued my daily beat, that song has put new vigor in my veins. When Mr. Lowell wrote that the phoebe scarce whistles once an hour to his fellow, he must have been listening to a far lazier specimen than those which I am acquainted. Most birds fall occasionally into a kind of ecstasy of song, and the wood peewee is no exception. One evening, after it had grown almost dark, a peewee flew out into the air directly above my head from a tree by the wayside, and began to sing in a perfect transport as he wheeled about. Then he swung back into the tree, keeping up his song in a continuous strain, and in sweet, half-caressing tones, until it finally died away, as if the bird had fallen into a doze during his vocal recital. I lingered about for some time, but he did not sing again. Why should he repeat his good-night song? I have frequently heard young peewees in midsummer singing in a continuous way instead of whistling the intermittent song of their elders. It sounds very droll, giving you the impression that the little neophyte has begun to turn the crank of his music box and can't stop. His voice is quite sweet, but his execution is crude. Wait, however, until he is 8 or 9 months older, and he will show you what a winged Orpheus can do. My notes say that on the 30th of July, 1891, I heard a peewee's quaint, prolonged whistle interlarded with his ordinary notes. Thus it will be seen that he is a somewhat versatile singer, proving the poet's lines half true and half untrue. Quote, "The birds but repeat without ending the same old traditional notes, which some, by more happily blending, seem to make over new in their throats." Unquote. Younger readers may perhaps need to be informed that the wood peewee belongs to the family of flycatchers, as do also the kingbird or bee martin, the phoebe bird, the great crested flycatcher, and a number of other interesting species, all of which have a peculiar way of taking their prey. The peewee will sit almost motionless on a twig, lisping his plaintive tune at intervals, until a luckless insect comes buzzing by, all unconscious of its peril. when the bird will make a quick dash at it, seize it dexterously between his mandibles, and then circle around gracefully to the same or another perch, having made a splendid catch on the fly. If the quarry he has taken is small, it slips at once down his throat, but should it be too large to be disposed of in that summary way, he will beat it into an edible form upon a limb before gulping it down. Agile as he is, he sometimes misses his aim, being compelled to make a second and occasionally even a third attempt to secure his prize. I have witnessed more than one comedy which turned out to be a tragedy for the ill-starred insect. Sometimes the insect will resort to the ruse of dropping toward the ground when it sees the bird darting toward it, and then a scuffle ensues that is really laughable, the pursuer whirling, tumbling, almost turning somersault in his desperate efforts to capture his prize. Once an insect flew between me and a peewee perched on a twig. When the bird darted down toward me with a directness of aim that made me think for a moment he would fly right into my face, but he made a dexterous turn in time, caught his quarry, and swung to a bough nearby. If one were disposed to be speculative, one might well raise Sidney Leniere's pregnant inquiry at this point, the reference being to the southern mockingbird and not to the peewee. How may the death of that dull insect be the life of yon trim Shakespeare on the tree? It has been my good fortune to find one, but only one, nest of this bird. It was placed on a horizontal branch about 15 feet above the ground, and was a neat, compact structure, decorated on the outside with grayish lichens and moss, giving it the appearance of an excrescence on the limb. It is said by those who have closely examined the nest that they are handsomely built and ornamented, and are equaled only by the dainty houses of the hummingbird and the blue-gray gnatcatcher. The eggs, usually 4 in number, are of a creamy white hue, beautifully embellished with a wreath of lavender and purplish brown around the larger end or near the center. Though our bird prefers solitary places for his home, he is far from shy. If you call on him in his haunt in the wildwood, he will sit fearless on his perch, even if you come quite near, looking at you in his staid, philosophical way, as if you were scarcely worth noticing. Nor will he hush his song at your approach, although he does not seem to care whether you listen to him or not. It is seldom that he can be betrayed into doing an undignified act, and even if he does almost turn a somersault in pursuing a refractory miller, he recovers his poise the next moment and settles upon his perch with as much sang-froid as if nothing unusual had occurred. Altogether, the wood peewee is what Bradford Torrey would call a character in feathers. End of The Wood Peewee by Leander S. Kaiser. Waiting for the Music by Bradford Torrey. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Waiting for the Music. I am impatient for the concert to begin. It is the 7th of February. For 3 weeks I have been in Miami. Birds are plentiful. The country, one may almost say, is full of them. The weather, mostly a few shades too warm for a pedestrian's comfort, seems to be all that birds could wish for. But thus far, there has been scarcely a sign of the grand vernal awakening. Warm or cold, for the birds it is still winter. Phoebes, to be sure, have sung ever since my arrival. I cannot help wondering why. And the same is true of white-eyed vireos. It is impossible to walk through the hammock woods without getting somewhat more than one's fill of their saucily emphatic deliverances. For aught I can see, they are quite as loquacious now as they will be 2 or 3 months hence. Once in a while, hardly oftener than once a week, I should say, I have heard a mockingbird letting himself loose, and rather more frequently, especially during the last few days, cardinal grosbeaks have sweetened the air with their whistle. But for much of the greater part, the birds are dumb. On the morning of February 1, as I stepped out upon the piazza, a house wren sang from a live oak by the kitchen door. I remembered the date. Good, said I to myself. The time of the singing birds is come. But I was too much in haste. Since then I have heard plenty of wren chattering, but not another note of wren music. Still, the opening of the annual concert cannot be much longer delayed. When I was in Florida 9 years ago, mockingbirds were in free song at St. Augustine before the middle of February, and at this point, 300 miles and more farther south, the season must be earlier rather than later. Some of the more distinctly southern of the birds about me I am especially desirous of hearing. The Florida yellowthroats, for example, a local race of the Maryland yellowthroat, so-called. They are everywhere in sight, the dark brown of the flanks distinguishing them readily. And as their music is said to be very unlike that of their familiar northern relative, I am naturally desirous of adding it to my memorized collection. It will be nothing great, presumably, but it will be something new. Still more interesting will be the Song of the Painted Bunting, or nonpareil, a beauty of beauties that I had never seen, a wild one, I mean, until this winter. About Miami, it is decidedly common, though the green females show themselves 10 times as often as the red, blue, and yellow-green males. What a superbly dressed creature the masculine nonpareil is, and he carries himself as if he knew it. Dear me, he seems always to be saying, this Joseph's coat of mine makes me so conspicuous. Some day it will be my undoing. My readers will most likely have seen the gorgeous little creature in cages. I found one many years ago in the Boston Public Garden, I remember. Though the chances are that they have never seen him in anything like his brightest and liveliest feather. A bird, like a butterfly, was born to be looked at out of doors with the sunlight on him. So far I have heard no note from the nonpareil except his rather soft chip. The birds frequent weedy tangles in open grounds, showing special fondness for patches of the white burr marigold, and seem to be well scattered over the country. Day after day I walk down through the hammock. I have spoken of it before, and most likely shall do so again, between Miami and Coconut Grove. Indeed, so constant are my peregrinations thither that I begin to find my innocent self treated as a kind of mysterious personage, one of the features of the place, so to speak, an object of interest, like the gumbo limbos, the air plants, and the blossoming lime trees. 3 times at least I have overheard a driver describing me to his fares as the man who comes down through the hammock every day, with strong emphasis on the last 2 words. One passenger was good enough to surmise quite audibly that I might be a botanist, while another loudly proclaimed his belief. I must be a sort of bird fiend. So much for being useful in one's day and generation. The tourist mind, like the tourist's stomach, abhors a vacuum. It must have something to browse upon, and the drivers know it. It is a bad day for the cow when she loses her cud. In sober truth, the hammock is well worth a daily visit. And almost as often as I am here, it comes over me what a glorious concert hall it will be when all these thousands of birds find their voices. If they ever do. For it may be, I know, that the great majority will start on their journey northward before that happy day arrives. Here, to name only some of the more common species, here are mockingbirds, catbirds, cardinals, house wrens, Carolina wrens, ruby-crowned kinglets, palm warblers, myrtle warblers, parula warblers, prairie warblers, black and white warblers, Florida yellowthroats, ovenbirds, blue-gray gnatcatchers, a host, white-eyed vireos, another host, solitary vireos, chewinks, painted buntings, phoebes, crested flycatchers, and bluejays. What a chorus there would be if the spring should get into all their throats at once! Might I be here to listen? Then, indeed, I could make a list with a hearing to help the eyesight. Now I follow the road and find only such birds as happen to be near it at the moment when I pass. Then it would be another story. I should need a stenographer. The names would crowd upon the pencil. It is really an astonishing, unnatural-seeming thing, this multitude of birds in this cloudless summer weather, with mating time so close at hand and no impulse to sing. Yet that expression is a trifle too strong, or at least too sweeping. This forenoon I heard a gnatcatcher warbling softly, as if to himself, tuning his instrument, it may be, or, more likely, dreaming. The cardinals, too, are certainly growing amorous. I see the bright males quarreling among themselves here and there. They are constantly in the road, and not infrequently, as I have said, they whistle with all sweetness. At that work there is no bird to excel them. How any female heart can resist such appeals is more than any bachelor's heart can imagine. I rejoice in their numbers. I should love to walk through the hammock and hear them all whistling together, a chorus a good mile in length, and no rod without a bird. Loggerhead shrikes are paired or pairing. The other day I saw one fly up from the ground and feed another perched on a telegraph wire. He was doing no more than was meet, her cool-appearing, unresponsive manner seemed to say. Mockingbirds also, though singing little, are beginning to manifest symptoms of jealousy. If all the mockers and all the cardinals should break into voice at once, the air itself would hardly contain the music. Two pileated woodpeckers that I see every few days at a particular spot in the hammock have already come to an understanding, or so I fancy from certain bits of conduct that I have been privileged to witness. This morning I stood watching the female as she hammered to pieces a decayed branch close to me, when all at once her mate called in the distance. Instantly she held up her head, as much as to say, "Hark! Was that he?" And the next moment she was gone. Then I heard low conversational notes, followed presently by loud drumming on a resonant stub or branch. I thought of what I have heard preachers say, that heaven is a state, not a place. Pileated woodpeckers are birds good to look at, and wild as they look, it is pleasant to find them so approachable. But in fact, this is most productive woodpecker country. Here are flickers in abundance, red-bellies almost as many, and along with them the red-headed, the red-cockaded in the pinelands, the yellow-bellied, least common of all, the downy and the hairy, all, in short, that could be expected, with the exception of the ivory-billed. And, such is human nature, I would give more to see him than all the rest together. Well, I will not wish time away, as the saying is. I begin to perceive that I have none to spare, but I shall rejoice when some morning I go out and find the conductor's arm lifted and the chorus minding the beat. End of Waiting for the Music by Bradford Torrey. Read by Tom Merritt.
Were I a Bird by Edward Smith Jones. Coffee Break Collection 37. More Birds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Were I a bird born free to fly, aloof on 2 wee downy wings, my canopy would be the sky when rosy morn its dawning springs. Were I a bird, I'd sweetly sing Earth's vesper song in tree-tops high, and chant the carol of the spring to every wary passer-by. Were I a bird, the sweetest voice that human ear has ever heard, the mocking-bird would be my choice, for he's the sweetest singing bird. Were I a bird, my life would be in keeping with the will divine. I'd sing his carols full and free in spreading oak and coney pine. Were I a bird, through air I'd roam, just flitting on the morning breeze, in search of summer's sunny dome, to live contently at ease. Were I a bird, I'd sing a tune for farmers seeking shady rest, beneath the spreading oak in June, in swinging boughs that rock my nest. Were I a bird, I'd scale the cliff when dawns the bleak December day, far from the ice and snow I'd shift until the fairest day in May. Were I a bird, a mockingbird, the king of birdies' singing sons, my music would forever be heard, as I sweet sang to cheerless ones. Were I a bird, I'd seek my rest, when jocund day blows out his light, in boughs that hover over my nest, I'd sweetly sing good night, good night. End of Were I a Bird by Edward Smith Jones. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.